The world today is going through profound changes unseen in a century. The trend of peace, development, and win-win cooperation, which means multi-centric international relations, is irreversible. The transition to a multipolar order is unstoppable, says Xi Jinping just before he landed in Moscow. So today, Xi Jinping, the president of the Chinese government, is in Moscow because he wants to mediate between Russia and Ukraine in order to bring peace and stability again to the war-torn country. So Xi Jinping landed in Moscow and he was received just a few hours ago by President Putin, who called him his friend, which is, in the Russian literature, when you call someone a friend, that means you trust that person. And this is something very important. People especially in the West, they don't understand the Eastern cultures, the Russian culture, the Middle Eastern culture, the Chinese culture. If a president like Putin calls Xi Jinping a friend, that means he trusts him. And he trusts him in his struggle against the Western hegemony, and also he trusts him to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. And this is something very important to notice. So after decades of playing a double game, the United States played a double game in the past decades, right? Especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States used to initiate wars, conflicts, coup d'etats, color revolutions, basically crises in different parts of the world. And then the United States used to present itself as a peacebreaker, or someone who can mediate, or someone who can present solutions. So just create problems and then present solutions. And the entire world has learned this strategy of the United States, and nobody is going to be fooled again by the US, this double game. So instead of relying on the United States double game or double standards, China is presenting itself as a neutral mediator between different conflicting parties. For example, one of the major conflicting parties in the Middle East for decades were Iran and Saudi Arabia. And thanks to China, they are now getting along. And President Raisi yesterday invited the King of Saudi Arabia to pay an official visit to Tehran. Something, guys, this is very, very important. You really need to understand that if Saudi Arabia and Iran get along in the Middle East, the chances for conflicts, whether it's a hot war or it's a proxy war, it will be minimized. And most of the proxy wars that happened in the past decades were due to this disagreement, let's say, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now, thanks to China, Middle East could finally see some peace. Unlike the United States, which initiated so many wars in the Middle East, direct interventions, and turning one neighbor against another to sell weapons, and also coup d'etats that happened in the past decade. So the Chinese side is using its soft power in this regard, which is diplomacy. And we were talking about diplomacy for at least now 1 year since the eruption of this very dirty conflict in Ukraine in February 2022. And we were saying diplomacy, guys, is the continuation of the war, but with different means. And to JoJo is better than to war. Let's try diplomacy. Why there is always this attempt to, if you say, let's rely on diplomacy to end the conflict in Ukraine, oh, you are a Putinist. You are a Putin apologist. No, we care about the Ukrainian people more than you do, you hypocrite, because we in Syria, we lived a war and we know what war means. And you know that we went through hell now to restore peace and stability in some parts of Syria. And this was also thanks to the allies of Syria, such as Russia, China, Iran, and not thanks to the United States or their allies. So the people can differentiate now the role of the United States and the role of the other countries. And this is making the United States quite nervous, because the people, especially the majority of the world, are no more buying the American BS, which is like, oh, I'm the neutral mediator. Let me introduce to you some solutions for your conflicts. Now, The Chinese mediation, in my opinion, is in favor. It's in favor of Ukraine because Ukraine is not going to win this war. And all this destruction that is happening in Ukraine, it's the infrastructure of Ukraine and the Ukrainians. And all these people dying in Ukraine are Ukrainians. So the priority should be ending the conflict and to bring the Russian and the Ukrainian side to a negotiating table. Unless you're a crazy maniac and you're using Ukraine as a cannon fodder, as your proxy against Russia. And we all know who is doing this. It's the United States. It's the United Kingdom. And let's remember, in March 2022, the Russians and the Ukrainians, they sat on a negotiation table, and the Brits, they ruined the negotiations. They told the Ukrainians that you shouldn't talk to Putin and that we will give you all the weapons you need, all the support you need to defeat Russia. And the brainless people in Kiev, they believed in this, that they can somehow win against a nuclear country which has tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. Something that really, sometimes I question, how can people like Zelensky become president? There are so many politicians in Western countries nowadays. They are like, I sometimes question, how can these people reach to power? It's like seeing a goat on a tree. And you ask yourself, how the hell this goat walked and reached over the top of a tree, for example. There's so many incompetent politicians in the West that are bringing this hell upon their people and upon the people in the rest of the world. So in March 2022, they were like diplomacy, and the Brits and the Americans, they stopped it. And now in March 2023, the Chinese are trying to mediate between the both sides to end the conflict. And who is against negotiation again? It's the United States. And I will show you now a video for John Kirby. He's the spokesperson of the White House. And he says, literally, the calls for ceasefire in Ukraine is unacceptable. I will show you the video.
That if coming out of this meeting, there's some sort of call for a ceasefire, well, that's just going to be unacceptable, because all that's going to do, Mike, is ratify Russia's conquest to date. All that's going to do is give Mr. Putin more time to refit, retrain, reman, and try to plan for renewed offensives at a time of his choosing. We hope, and we've said this before, that President Xi will call and talk to President Zelensky, because we believe the Chinese need to get the Ukrainian perspective here.
Mm-hmm. This is quite funny, in my opinion, because this is exactly how the United States thinks about ceasefires, truce, diplomacy. And we know that when there were the Minsk Agreement 1 and the Minsk Agreement 2, the United States, with the confession of the former Chancellor of Germany, the former President of France, and even the former President of Ukraine, they all said that we use this agreement, the Minsk agreements, to buy time in order for Ukraine to get all the arms they need and all the equipment they need to fight against Russia. So this is a projection of what the U.S., how the U.S. sees negotiations and diplomacy, and they're projecting it on Russia. Now, today I found a very interesting article which I want to share with you in this exact topic. I think it's worth of sharing it, and it's on the Infobricks. So it's written by Lucas Leros. He's our friend, journalist. He's a researcher at the Center for Geostrategic Studies, geopolitical consultant, and I hosted him on Syriana analysis to speak about Brazil recently. So he says the case of John Kirby, who says like we object negotiations and it is unacceptable. The case shows quite clearly that the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev is just a proxy for NATO, not having the capacity to decide sovereignly whether or not to negotiate an agreement. The spokesperson sees, what was his name? John Kirby. John Kirby sees the growing Russian-Chinese cooperation as an attempt to end the, quote, rules-based order and reverse the legacy of post-World War II international society. According to him, Russia and China, quote, do not like the order built by the US and its allies and want to rewrite the world according to new guidelines, with the current partnership being a part of this process. Russia and China plan to change the current world order, not because they are averse to the idea of a world guided by diplomacy and international law, but because the order that has prevailed in recent decades is essentially unipolar. There are no real, quote, rules in the prevailing order. There is only the unilateral will of the US being imposed on all nations. This is obviously something the Russians and Chinese want to change. It is not about, quote, not liking what the US and its allies built in the post-World War II, but critically understanding that since the end of the Cold War, the US acted as a hegemonic power at the global level, with carte blanche to commit crimes, coups d'etats, invasions, and wars, while all other states have their freedom restricted by what is called rules, which are not applicable to Washington. This is something that needs to be changed, and indeed, Russian-Chinese cooperation works in this direction. On the other hand, it is interesting to see how the US decides whether or not Kiev should negotiate peace. If Ukraine is indeed a sovereign state, as the West hypocritically claims when it condemns Russia's reintegration referendums in the East, then it is the Zelensky government that must decide whether or not to accept a ceasefire, regardless of the circumstances and imposed conditions. However, once again, it is clear that the Kiev regime is only a proxy in NATO's war with Russia, having no authority to decide whether or not to continue fighting. Indeed, it is absolutely rational for the Chinese to pay more attention to Russian interests and talk to Putin before Zelensky. Moscow is winning the war, and the winning side naturally needs to have its interests heard first during a peace negotiation. This is a basic principle of diplomacy, but the West insists on ignoring it both because it needs to publicly maintain the, quote, Ukrainian victory narrative, and because it wants the conflict to prolong indefinitely. To be honest with you, I agree with a lot with this article, and I truly believe that the Ukrainian government is a puppet government for NATO, and I truly believe that they don't have the decision-making process in their hands. I truly believe that Ukraine is being hijacked. Ukraine is being now it's taken as a hostage. And the people in Ukraine are paying a very heavy price for a conflict that they cannot win. And all this talk about we will support Ukraine as long as it takes, it means we will fight against Russia by using the Ukrainians as long as it takes. And this is a crime against humanity. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are perishing in Ukraine. And also on the Russian side, of course, they don't care about the Russian death toll. They also don't care about the Ukrainian death toll, because if they do, they would now encourage to end this conflict and not to prolong it, just like John Kirby is now telling us. And to be honest with you, it seems that the NATO side is preparing for another escalation in Ukraine. And this time, probably, the Polish side may intervene directly. And there are reports that say there are Polish troops in Ukraine already. I'm not sure about that. But now the Polish ambassador to France, he says that his country may intervene directly if Ukraine fails to defend its own sovereignty. Let's take a look.
Donc, aujourd'hui, l'Ukraine va défendre sa indépendance. Sinon, en tout état de cause, nous serons obligés de rentrer dans ce conflit parce que nos valeurs principaux qui étaient le fondement de notre civilisation, de notre culture, de notre seront en danger fondamental. Donc, on n'a pas de choix aujourd'hui.
So, either Ukraine will defend its independence today, or we will be forced to enter into this conflict because blah, 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 our main values and all this stuff. So, Poland is a NATO state. If Poland intervenes in Ukraine, that means NATO intervened in Ukraine. And if Russia retaliates against Polish targets, that means NATO can activate its joint defense alliance and can intervene in this war directly too. So I'm really, really worried, guys. I'm really worried of how this conflict is being developed in Ukraine. And I'm worried that this could get out of hands. And I'm not trying to fearmonger. I'm bringing you my objective analysis, and I will base it on few things. First, China is increasingly becoming a reliable partner for peace and not war, which really annoys and angers the United States. Two, Russia represents for the rest of the world who were suffering a lot under the American hegemony. Now they see Russia as a representation of a force that can fight against the US hegemony and end it. So in the last video, remember, I mentioned that there are so many people around the world who would not agree with the Russian offensive on Ukraine. And they would say, oh, okay, if you see to the international law, it is maybe illegal, but all these wars that happened were also illegal, and we were suffering under American hegemony, and we want to end it. That's why we don't mind that Russia is in Ukraine. So we have to understand this perspective too. Three, the International Criminal Court decision is, in my opinion, the last nail in the coffin of any chance for a negotiating settlement between Ukraine and Russia. And maybe this was the main goal of this decision just before Xi Jinping's trip to Russia. So here I want to give you opinion. Do you think the ICC decision will end any chance for negotiation, or China will be able to revive these chances? Let me know in the comments below, guys. And lastly, when you see all these things are happening in front of you, and if you read history and see how empires collapsed, you will see a pattern in a lot of empires, the last years of the empires or the last decades of the empires. You will see that every time an empire feels that its power is shrinking, they become more aggressive. They take or they adopt policies that go against their own survival. And they go into crazy mode. And they may miscalculate because they want to preserve their hegemonic status. So there are elites who would say, if I'm not in power, if I'm not in a position of hegemonic status, why would I care what comes after me? So it's either me or them. There's so many empires who would do that. And I don't rule out that the United States would do that too. I'm really worried about that. And I'm serious. And I think in these current circumstances, when you see that Ukraine isn't winning on the ground, Russia is advancing every day in Ukraine, and when you see that the unilateral sanctions against Russia isn't working, and Russia's economy is performing well, while your banks are bankrupting in the United States, and your energy resources are being destroyed in Europe, your companies are declaring bankruptcy, it's like it's backfired. All these sanctions looks like they backfired. And you don't have any other means now. You used the proxy warfare against Russia. You're supporting Ukraine and all the battalions there with everything you can supply. 2, you're supporting Ukraine financially. 3, you're supporting Ukraine diplomatically. You're imposing sanctions on Russia and also on China and Iran and all these countries who are challenging the US hegemony, and these sanctions aren't working. What other options left for the United States and its allies? Direct war. I don't see any other way. So they either withdraw from the international scene peacefully, or share the authorities, the hegemonic status with the rest of the world, or they will go for war. There are no other options, in my opinion. These are the 2 options. So today we will see what Xi Jinping will be in Russia for 3 days, 3 working days, and it's in my opinion, it's good news, and it probably will bring some sanity to international relations. We will see in 2 or 3 days what they have agreed. Of course, they're not going to declare everything, but we will know some of the details sooner or later. So let's hope that this meeting works, and there would be some sane people or sane politicians in the West who would pursue their own interests, the interests of Ukraine, and also the interests of their opponents. Can they defeat Russia and China now together? No. China is increasingly supporting Russia economically, and the Russian economy is doing well. The Russian side has a huge military factories. They are self-sufficient in energy and in food. So you have the energy, the food, and the economy is functioning. So they can survive. On the other hand, European countries don't have a stable energy source. Their economy is increasingly collapsing. The banks are declaring bankruptcy in the United States. I mean, it's not working well for them. So I'm really worried about that. Now, before I end up this video, guys, the visit of President Assad to the UAE, I already mentioned that the focus was on economic investment. It seems that the Syrian side will give exclusive investment rights for the Emirati side in Syria, especially in the energy sector, in the humanitarian sector, education sector, etc. The UAE is mediating between Syria and the rest of the Arab world. And the UAE's president says that it's time for Syria to return to the Arab family. And in my opinion, it's not that Syria left the Arab family, the Arabs left Syria in this Islamist terroristic war waged by the United States and its allies in the region. And another good news, there was a security meeting between Syria and Saudi Arabia in Riyadh a few days ago. And Saudi Arabia agreed to reopen its consulate in Damascus. And the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia will visit Syria most probably in April. I think in the mid of April, he will visit Damascus. And this will be the beginning of the restoration of ties between Syria and Saudi Arabia. And this will probably delay any sort of rapprochement between Syria and Turkey. Because Syria has now so many options. UAE is opening, Bahrain is opening, Egypt is opening, Jordan has opened. Now the Saudis want to open relations, restore ties with Syria. And in Turkey, there are elections. So from the Damascus perspective, they don't see why would they meet with Erdogan and give him support in the elections, or support him in these elections, give him a diplomatic victory, where the fact is the opposition in Turkey, they say, if we win, we will withdraw from Syria anyways. And Erdogan he wants to withdraw from Syria, but with conditions. So from the Syrian side, it is better, in my opinion, to wait and see the results of the elections. And if Erdogan wins, you can sit with him and negotiate, but from a stronger position, because you have now all the Arab countries behind your back who also dislike the Turkish influence in the region. And secondly, if Erdogan doesn't win, then the opposition already, for example, the head of the opposition, sometimes I forget the names, but the head of the opposition in Turkey, when the earthquake hit Syria, he sent a memo or a telegram to Assad expressing his solidarity with Syria. And every time there is a talk about Syria, they say, we don't want to stay in Syria, we want to withdraw from Syria, and we want to send the refugees back. So it's a win-win situation for Syria in all cases if Damascus opens ties with the Arab countries. Anyway, so I will end up this video with you guys with the video of the President Assad visit to the UAE and what President Assad told the UAE president and what the UAE president told Assad. It's just a small clip, but we will see you again tomorrow. Let's check this video together.
غيبتكم يا السوريين غيبة طولت، واشتقنا لكم، فحان الوقت أن سوريا ترجع إلى محيطها العربي، إلى إخوانها العرب. نحن نحاول نبني معكم علاقة ومد جسور وتقوية هذا الجسر بيننا وبين أهلنا في سوريا، فائدة الطرفين. أحسن الله عزاكم في أهلنا في سوريا، وإن شاء الله بقيادتكم وبهمة السوريين هذه تحدي بتحدونه. أخوانكم في الإمارات قلبا وقالبا معكم.
شكرا لكم سمو الشيخ. من لم يشكر الناس لم يشكر الله، وبالتالي لابد من البدء من الشكر. السوريين اليوم لما عم يحكوا بعد هالشهر اللي مر بيقول لك الواضح تماما انه طريقة مساعدة الإمارات مليئة بالمحبة، فهذا الشيء أغلى من أي شيء آخر بيتقدم، وإن شاء الله نحن كمان بدنا نكون أوفياء لهالعلاقة بنفس الطريقة. الشيخ زايد الله يرحمه عرفته بمواقف عابرة، الوالد هو اللي كان بيعرفه أكثر، كانوا مثل أخوة. أنا معرفتي فيه باللقاءات القليلة اللي صارت، وبنعرفه إنسان طيب ومحبوب وإلى آخره، ولكن الآن صرنا بنشوفه بشكل أوضح. بنعرف اليوم تماما ما هي الدولة اللي بناها ومن هي العائلة اللي أسسها.
الله يا أريد أكد فخامة رئيس أن نحن إخوانكم وأهلكم وهذه بلدك. تشرفنا اليوم بوجودك، أتمنى إن شاء الله أن تكون زيارة نبني عليها هذا الجسر القوي لبناء علاقات تصب في مصلحة أهلنا هناك.
تسلم الله،
شرفتونا يا سيدي.
So, I've been your host, Kirk Almasian of Syriana Analysis. If you're new, please subscribe and hit the like button. And if you want to support my independent work, please become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.